So one of the main questions that people are asking themselves is, what can we learn from the experience in COVID and the journey that consumers have to go on in relation to net zero? And I think there are some parallels that can be drawn that are very instructive. So obviously during the COVID crisis, we've seen people being asked to change their behaviour in ways that are uncomfortable, or being asked to do things that perhaps they've never done before. And when people think about net zero, there's easy parallels being drawn there between asking people maybe to cut meat out of their diet, or to get rid of gas boilers, or to change from a petrol and diesel car, to go into uncharted territory and do new things. And I think those are reasonable parallels, but equally there are some differences. So in COVID, it very much was an emergency and a crisis, and people could see the impact that COVID was having on the lives of people around them, maybe within their own lives, with immediate effect. The distance between causation and outcome was very small. And as a result of that, there were strong motivations of people to make the necessary changes to improve the circumstances for the good of society, for the good of their family, for the good of their friends. And I think the challenge around net zero is that distance between causation and outcome is spread over a much longer period. And it's only actually in very recent times that people have seen the impact of climate change reach into their daily lives and begin to have an effect on friends, family, society, communities and economies. Wildfires in Greece and Europe as an example, wildfires in Australia as another example. And maybe that will spur the kind of immediate action that we've seen with COVID. But I think it's unlikely to be a ubiquitous effect, as some parts of the world, the emitting parts of the world, are not impacted in the same way, at the same pace, with the same intensity. And therefore, there's a temptation, I guess, for people to shrug their shoulders and see this as tomorrow's problem. And by tomorrow, we mean several decades, not the immediacy of tomorrow. So I think that speaks to a different kind of motivation or incentive that we need to put in play with consumers if we're going to ask them to make those changes. And this incentive has to be as much about hope, in fact, more about hope and positivity than just bombarding people with pictures of Armageddon skies and talks of crisis and emergency. People are going to need to see the positive impacts and positive changes on lifestyle, on air quality, on communities from making changes that take effect not just in 10, 15, 20 years' time, but today, immediately. And this becomes more of a positive motivator to ask people to change than a negative incentive to get people to change. And that message of hope, I think, is really important, because a lot of the narrative thus far, and it's understandable why this might be the case, has very much been painting that picture of the worst outcomes that could arise if we let climate change continue unchecked, as opposed to the positive outcomes that definitely can arise if we take action to address that now. And if we focus just on the negative outcomes here, there is a real danger that people will almost think it's too late. What can I do about it? What can we do about it in our country when there's other countries around the world that continue to emit as an example? And that will be a missed opportunity, because actually it's not just about the macro global position in 10, 20, 30 years' time. It's about making improvements today in our houses, on our streets, in our communities, in the country we live in, that can have a positive impact. And the other thing that people have been reflecting on was, how can government build on that learning, and what should be its next step in addressing how to build on the Prime Minister's 10-point plan and the voluminous recent initiatives and policy consultations that have emerged from government. And I think the one area that I would absolutely focus on is grappling with the issue of costs. So what tends to happen in UK energy policy is the ambition is set incredibly high, and that is extremely laudable. And with COP26 on the immediate horizon, you can see why the UK government wants to continue with setting very bold ambitions for reducing emissions and meeting carbon budgets and progressing towards net zero. But the real challenge comes with how do you set aside the right amount of funding, investment and money to support those very, very lofty ambitions. And we immediately see the debate reduced to newspaper headlines and chatter amongst the political classes about bill costs. And I think that needs to be tackled head on. And there needs to be a very, very open dialogue about the cost, benefits, the risks and opportunities that emerge around this transition. And have a really transparent debate with the public, who are simultaneously taxpayers, consumers and citizens, about those cost benefits over the short, medium and long term, and start to enlist them on the being participants and active agents in that transition. But they can understand what that's going to mean for them in terms of the amount they may have to pay for energy, or the way in which they engage with energy in all aspects of our economy. So that's point number one, tackle that issue of transparency around costs head on. And I think by doing that, that will also prompt significant focus amongst politicians in how do we come up with a more equitable way of dealing with those costs. For too long, it's been easy to layer in costs to support policies and then turn around and wag the finger at energy companies for increasing bills. I'm not trying to relieve energy companies of practices to increase their margin or improve profitability that sometimes are probably at the sharp end of what one would consider to be fair practices. But it is an underlying trend that the costs of supporting the transition as a proportion of bills is increasing. And we have to ask ourselves the question, as we're about to embark on further investments to decarbonise the really hard to reach sectors of the economy, like heat and transport, whether it's appropriate to put those costs into bills, which is generally a relatively regressive way of recovering costs, or think about other ways in which the transition might be funded. And I don't think it really matters whether you make a transition between the electricity bill and the gas bill in the long term, because you end up in the same place over time. So by having an honest and transparent debate over the costs and benefits over different time horizons really opens up an opportunity then to talk about what is the right means of recovering those costs in a progressive way, in a fair way, in a way that's not going to see us reach political dead ends from time to time that really prevent us from making the progress that we should be making.